My name is Tom Keating, and I'm Director of RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies here in London. And it's my pleasure to introduce and be the chair for today's webinar. Before getting started, as usual, we'd ask you to absorb the housekeeping points on the screen. And please note that the full webinar, including the Q&A section, is being recorded. If you want to ask a question, please pose it in writing in the now familiar fashion in the Q&A box, and do please include your name and organizational affiliation to help us give a sense of where you are coming from with your question. Just a quick word on RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies. I suppose you're here, so you may well be familiar with us, but for those of you who are not, we established the programme in 2014 as a specialist research programme within RUSI on the intersection of illicit finance and security. And through our work, we strive towards a world where confronting financial crime is a collective responsibility through our contribution of pioneering analysis and actionable ideas, notably via our partnership-based approach and promotion of viable solutions. And we aim for our research to equip the international community with the knowledge, tools, and ideas to understand, identify, and disrupt the threats of illicit finance. And of course, we seek to convene the right cross-section of brains to consider the challenges posed by finance and security, which I'm sure you'll agree we've certainly done today. When we began our finance and security program at RUSI in 2014, we purposefully excluded fraud from our scope. But over the past few years, fraud has moved rapidly up the agenda of those with whom we interact in government and the private sector. And importantly, in the context of today's discussion, the security dimension of the UK's fraud threat has become unavoidable. Over the past month, RUSI has published two major studies on fraud in the UK. Earlier this week, some of you may have attended the launch of RUSI's paper on cyber fraud and the UK's response. But today, we're going to broaden our focus and consider the second of those papers, the impact of fraud on UK national security, published in January. You can find both these papers free to download on the RUSI website. So to discuss these issues today, I'm delighted to be joined by CFCS Associate Fellow Helena Wood, lead author of the paper. I'm also delighted that Mike Haley, CEO of CIFAS, which kindly funded our work on this paper, and Amber Rudd, since July last year, a RUSI trustee, and with other very relevant experience that I'm sure we'll hear about more in due course, have agreed to join us as discussants on this topic. So if the panelists could turn on their cameras, we'll first hear from Helena with her presentation of the paper before we turn to Mike and Amber for their reflections. As ever, we would welcome your thoughts, comments, and questions as participants in today's webinar. And so do please make good use of the Q&A box, and I will do my best to cover as much of your input as is possible. So with all that said, that's all from me for now, and I will pass the floor to Helena.
Well, brilliant. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm really pleased to see the amount of debate that this particular paper has sparked at a really critical time in the UK's approach to tackling fraud. We've got the Action Fraud Service, much beleaguered, being redesigned as we speak. We're going to have some pretty critical spending review decisions being made in the next 12 months, which will really set out the future response, particularly in government terms, to tackling fraud. And we've also got the ongoing integrated review, which is continuing to discuss and consider our overall approach to national security. So I really hope the findings of this paper can feed into all three of those discussions and have some worth in what is a really critical time for the UK's turning point in its approach to fraud. But when I was coming to write the notes for this event, it really made me think back to why we'd actually gone on this journey in the first place. And it took me back to the 25th of February last year, and the last in-person event I certainly held at RUSI. And it was an event on policing economic crime and the future of that response. And as usual with all our Whitehall events, I coerced all of my Whitehall colleagues and contacts into attending. And one of those was a to-be-unnamed civil servant sitting in the national security architecture, who approached me after the event and collared me and said, well, that's all really, really interesting, but why should I care about this? Is fraud a national security issue? And not wanting to shy away from a difficult question, I picked that one up, and 12 months later, 15,000 words and a certain amount of blood, sweat and tears, I answered his or her question, and the answer was emphatically yes. fraud is absolutely a national security issue. So I could stop there, but I think now I've got you captive, I'd like to talk you through what we're saying in our paper that helped us to come to that conclusion. But before I do, I think it's really worth backing up and coming to the point of how that individual came to approach me in the first place to ask that question. And as we know, many people attending this webinar from the fraud space know that fraud was really a politically dormant issue for decades, very much seen as this low harm crime against vulnerable or elderly people, or perhaps less charitably, the naive, and certainly absolutely nothing to trouble the National Security Council with. But many of us watching have watched that steadily climb up the political agenda over the past 18 months. And I've certainly never seen so much political airtime committed to fraud. And it's really important to ask why that is, because in answering that question, we come to some of the conclusions of our paper. So the first reason why is, really by dint of scale. The scale of fraud is really spiraling out of control, whether that's fraud against businesses, whether it's fraud against individuals, or whether it's fraud against the public purse, something we're going to be hearing a lot more about as we look into the COVID-19 frauds against public business support schemes. And certainly the inclusion of fraud into the crime survey for England and Wales has really revealed the hidden nature of fraud, e.g. how much of it is unreported to our law enforcement services, which really just see the top of the iceberg in terms of reporting. So scale is certainly one factor that's pushed this up the political agenda. But I think there's something else that's really, really critical here, and it's the changing victim profile. We have seen an acceleration of our digitalization of everyday life over the past 12 months, but that's certainly not a new thing. Everyone's increasingly living their lives online, and that's certainly going to continue as we go forward. And that's a good thing in many ways, but it also puts us all on the front line of fraud. We're all now potential victims because that digitalization makes us all vulnerable in many ways. And not only that, the criminals are able to use that internet age and that access to online services to network better and to increase their ability to learn about social engineering techniques, to access cyber hacking tools, to get spoofing services, crime as a service to support fraud. So that victim is no longer purely the elderly or the vulnerable, it's all of us, and it's everyone sitting on this webinar today. I'm sure all of us probably in the last 24 hours have received some sort of phishing email or spoof text. It's a part of everyday life now. And the result of all of this is that Parliament's taking attention because MPs' inboxes are filling up with their constituents' emails, with woeful tales of losses of entire life savings, businesses going under due to fraud, and people complaining about the lack of government response to that. So MPs and the media and Parliament are paying attention. And the result of all this, politicians are talking about fraud, and that's a really, really good thing. However, and there's always an however, isn't there? Nothing's changed. Going back to my events in February 2020, have we seen anything change in the last 12 months? Well, sadly, we haven't. There's still a woeful underfunding of fraud policing. We didn't see anything in the spending review that kind of made me feel particularly happy about the change. We haven't seen any sort of systemic change in the UK's response to fraud, which takes us to our paper. And the premise of that paper is really that the current response to fraud is not working. And the Einstein quote is one I overuse. So those of you who see me speak before, I do apologize. But the very definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We cannot solve the fraud problem simply by doing more of the same. And viewing the problem purely as a criminal justice issue isn't going to change the response at all. There's certainly a better criminal justice response is essential, and I'll touch on that later if I may. The fundamental premise of our paper is we need to approach fraud from a completely different angle, and the angle we think you should approach it from is as a national security threat. But there's two questions there I'm sure you're asking in your heads as you listen. Well, what does that achieve? Firstly, why? Is that going to change anything? Isn't it just shifting things around Whitehall? And what is the case for doing so? So I will start with the first of these. What does it achieve to look at something as a national security threat? Well, the first of these, it achieves some form of leadership. And we certainly know around fraud, there's been this huge responsibility vacuum around fraud in the UK system. As we say in our paper, it's everybody's problem, but absolutely nobody's priority. And that's a real key part as to why we're not seeing any changes to the scale and tempo that we need. And secondly, being quite cynical here, national security issues tend to fare quite well in spending reviews. And this is certainly an issue that would benefit from greater government funding. And that's not just for the criminal justice response, which again, I'll touch on later. And then thirdly, national security threats get that whole of system response. And it's a trite and again, overused phrase, but we don't just need a criminal justice response, we need the intelligence community to play their role here, even our diplomatic community and to some extent the development community spending funds in places to help local law enforcement tackle local problems that impact on the UK. So that's the benefit of a national security approach, which we set out in the paper, but what is the case for seeing fraud as a national security threat? And in our paper, we looked at that from two specific angles. One, of how fraud intersects with the UK's national security objectives. And then secondly, we looked at fraud as a vector of some of our existing recognised national security priority threats, being serious organised crime and terrorism. So I'll start with the first of those. How did we see fraud intersecting with our national security objectives? Well, we selected two of the three national security objectives to look at in detail. The first was protecting our people, which may seem quite obvious, but I'll go into quite why we need to look at fraud as an issue under that particular threat. And then secondly, promoting UK prosperity. And again, I'll go into detail. But with all of that, we looked at much beyond the financial losses, which frequently dominate the headlines around fraud, because we need to understand fraud, not in terms simply of the financial losses, but its impact more widely on society, on our with our relationship with the state, and criminological impacts as well. So we looked at all of those in the paper. And briefly, if I can boil down many thousands of words and many words read into three broad messages that we picked up there. The first was, the lack of response to fraud against individuals. Yes, that's impacting on them financially, but it's more fundamentally weakening that bond between the state and citizens, because it's weakening faith in policing and the rule of law. And we certainly see that through the stats around the level of experienced fraud as opposed to reported fraud. People aren't reporting fraud to the police because they think they're going to do anything about it. And what does that say about people's relationship with policing when it comes to a crime that they are most likely to fall victim to, as opposed to any other? So I think we really have to question the impact of fraud on the rule of law and faith in policing in our national security response. The second message really is around the impact of fraud against business. And yes, that hits their bottom line. It's seen as a cost of doing business in many respects, but we also need to look at it on a more macro level and the impact of that against the reputation of the UK as a place to do business. We really need to start attracting business to the UK as we hit probably the deepest and darkest recession in living memory, and as we relaunch ourselves on the global stage post-Brexit. So we really need to look at how Britain's fraud problem against business really impacts on the public view of the UK as an investment destination. And then thirdly, something I said we're going to hear a lot more about, but public sector fraud. Even in advance of COVID, by the government's own estimation, we were looking at fraud against public spending of around £40 billion per annum, which is roughly the extent of the UK's defence budget. So it's no small beer. And not only is that impacting on the delivery of frontline services, which is really obviously important and has been called a heist on public services, but more fundamentally as well, it impacts on that perception of the state and reduces trust and confidence in the government's ability to manage finances, which can have a really societally corrosive impact on people's attitudes towards things like paying tax. That argument that why am I paying my tax if the government's only going to waste it? And then that becomes an entrenched position. And that can only be an unhealthy perception of the UK state and legitimising tax dodging when we really need to get every penny in we can in the current scenario. So that was our intersection with the national security objectives. And then secondly, as I said, we looked at the intersection with the existing recognised national security threats of organised crime and terrorism. Starting with organised crime, we noticed by the sheer scale and nature of the fraud threat, the majority of fraud experienced in Britain is serious organised crime, no doubt about it. But despite this, we found these huge intelligence gaps around the scale, the perpetrators, the source countries, and a really concerning deficit in the serious organised crime policing response around serious organised fraud. So in short, we've got a really serious blind spots around serious organised fraud as a vector of our national serious organised crime threat. But on terrorism, we found a very different picture. There is very ample evidence of the use of fraud, both at the terrorist organisation level as a terrorist financing tool, whether that's Islamic, right-wing, Northern Irish, you name it, they're all using fraud to fund their activities. But also in the kind of small cell lone actor terrorism that we increasingly see as a feature of our very specific threat to the UK as that evolves, in this kind of fund the terrorist rather than the terrorist acts, with people defrauding benefits agencies and student loan companies to fund their general lifestyle to support their terrorist lifestyle that supports these small cell and lone actor terrorism threats. So if I can put that all back together at the end, if that isn't a case for fraud as a national security threat, then I'm really not sure what the threshold is. But moving on to our recommendations, so I've only got a small amount of time. We have put forward 15 recommendations, which I will allow you to read. I would really, really encourage you to download the report. And I'll give you the highlights of those in this webinar before you do. Fundamentally, we need a cross-government public-private fraud strategy that sits under the National Security Council in our view. That we don't have a national strategy to tackle fraud is quite baffling, given the scale and nature of the threat against UK citizens and businesses. And within this, we absolutely need a much greater role for our intelligence services. This is a global threat, and a lot of that threat emanates from overseas and partially in countries where the criminal justice response cannot touch or hope to touch. So we really need the intelligence community to be stepping up their role in tackling fraud, and even our diplomatic community. And I've repeated quite often that the criminal justice response isn't the sole answer to this problem, but it absolutely has to be part of it. And our decades of underinvestment in the fraud policing response have to stop here, and we have to rebuild that specialism within policing. So what we really need is a properly funded and networked policing response. And I'd say you could learn a lot from the CT policing model here, with a centrally coordinated but locally delivered response to another national security threat. On those kind of specific threat vectors, serious organised crime, we really need to see a high-level intelligence requirement coming out of the National Security Council just to really understand the nature of the serious organised fraud threat. And we absolutely need to see a greater role for serious organised crime policing and tackling fraud. It's too often been sidelined against other, in quotes, sexier crimes such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, but it absolutely needs to sit there front and centre of the SOC policing response for sure. And then in terrorism, we absolutely need to maintain the place of counter fraud as a tool in disrupting terrorist financing. It's there, but it's slipping back. We really need to keep that there. So if I can pack that all back together before handing back to Tom, in short, going back to that conversation with the unnamed civil servant last year in February, I really don't think we can be questioning whether fraud is a recognised security threat anymore. We need to be questioning the risk of not applying a national security approach to it. So thank you for listening. I'll pass back to you, Tom, now.
Helena, thank you. Thanks very much. I'm sure we'll be scanning the attendee list from last February to try and work out who that was. So with those opening remarks said, Mike, we'll turn to you now, if we may, in your role at CIFAS. Mike.
Thank you, Tom, and to Helena. And can I say that I very much welcome this report and its recommendations. So for those of you who don't know, my organisation, CIFAS, is a not-for-profit body with 550 members from many different economic sectors, primarily the financial services, the retail banks, the credit card issuers, loan companies and insurers. And on their behalf, we operate the National Fraud Database and the Internal Fraud Database, and we've been doing that for 30 years. But we supported this research because we've seen year on year underlying increases in fraud. And although through that sharing of data and intelligence, we save our members 1.5 billion per year, the number of fraud attacks keeps increasing. In fact, in 2019, our members filed a record 365,000 cases of fraud to the National Fraud Database. 88% of that were cyber-enabled, and over 60% was identity fraud. And as Helena pointed out, and many other reports have, the impacts of fraud are multiple. Individual losses can be devastating, and it's well documented the psychological impacts on victims. Businesses can fail. Public money doesn't reach frontline services. Nevertheless, and this is my first main point of 3 points I really want to make, I think we fail to take into account where much of the proceeds of fraud goes. In fact, we're often distracted into a debate about who should be the ones to pay the fraudsters. Should it be the individual or the bank? I would argue that we're really looking at the problem down the wrong end of the telescope. And what I mean by that is that if you look through the small end, you see the bigger picture, that all those individual small frauds against individuals, against businesses in different sectors, sums up to billions of pounds that are stolen through fraud. And I believe it's largely going into the hands of organized crime. And it's then funding other harmful activities. And so one of the issues we've been wrestling with, and I think one of the questioners points out, is that it's not particularly salient to individuals. If I get burgled, I basically tell my neighbors, watch out, there's a burglar about. But in fact, I can't remember the last time someone reported to me in my neighborhood were burgled or their car stolen. But fraud is happening all the time behind closed doors, and we don't share that information. So the individual frauds don't get onto the radar of police and crime commissioners, local councillors, etc. But so we should look at the other way and say, where is all those individual frauds going? And it's going into a pot which is being used by organised crime and the dishonest. So, and moreover, I think we don't seem to be concerned, but we should be, because we really don't know how much of the proceeds of fraud go to organised crime, who those criminals are, and what they're doing with that money. So I think a key recommendation for me is to fill that intelligence gap using our national security resources. So we really do understand what's the impact on the UK of that accumulation of fraud. Secondly, and I've said this before, I do consider fraud to be the volume crime of the 21st century. As I mentioned, losses to fraud outstrips the losses to all other acquisitive crimes. And in fact, over the decades, because of investment in fraud prevention, in crime prevention, we've seen other acquisitive crimes drop year upon year. But we've seen fraud increase each time. And that's really because where it's value these days. The value is not in cash and assets anymore. It's digitally held, it's in the cloud, it's in accounts. And therefore, those who want to get money no longer rob banks through the front door. They're robbing banks through the digital channels and the mobile channels. So fraud is really technology enabled. Internet mobile commerce has enabled identity fraud, application fraud, and account takeover fraud to be perpetrated on an industrial scale. So we've seen a significant shift between an old style kind of view on your head of a fraudster being a con man, an individual con man. We now have an organized and technologically enabled group who are attacking our financial institutions. We also know that there's readily available large quantities of personal information from data breaches and social engineering. And that's the raw material that you need for industrial attempts at accounts to be opened, to identity fraud to be perpetrated, and accounts to be taken over. And I say lastly, and this goes to Helena's point around the response, is that not only do we believe that is fraud perceived as a low risk and high reward activity for criminals, there really is a low risk of being caught, prosecuted, and punished for fraud. It's not just a perception. So what are we up against? And I think the information from our organised fraud intelligence groups, which we run up and down the country of our members, is that fraud is not being perpetrated by a traditional type of organised crime, but what could be viewed as a virtual mafia. That is a loosely connected set of entrepreneurial criminals who exchange data and techniques, and they do that on both the dark web, but also on the surface web in plain sight. I think you mentioned crime as a service. Well, in the fraud arena, you have specialists who sell their expertise in harvesting personal information, expertise in writing malware and ransomware script, expertise in being able to spoof mobile numbers and email addresses. And we have a kind of whole group of people who are skilled at social engineering, that is manipulating individuals, whether at the call center or face-to-face or on the phone to individuals, to manipulate them into a fraud. So I think much of what we see in particular identity fraud and account takeover, has the hallmarks of organized fraud because it requires technique, organization, and having to really push into mobile and online portals, thousands and thousands of attempts at speed across multiple organizations. So I guess my second main point is that we need to understand more about how fraud operates and be able to disrupt it in an equally organized and industrial manner to the way that fraud is being perpetrated, not on an individual basis, but on that industrial basis. Thirdly, and I think it has been more and more acknowledged, and I think this is a good time for this, that fraud has become more salient. And so we are recognizing it as a significant problem, but we also recognize that the existing response to fraud is poor. I think this is particularly woeful response to fraud against business for many reasons. I think businesses are often seen as, big institutions deserve to be defrauded in some way, they can afford it. Individual victims are given even less sympathy, sometimes seen as gullible, greedy, some ways deserving. And that's why I think we need to look at it down the other end of the telescope. Where is that money going into whose pockets? The response to fraud is poor because fraud, I think, would always be a Cinderella service within policing and the National Crime Agency compared to other more readily understandable crimes. And police are therefore ill-equipped and unresponsive because it's simply not a priority. And once again, I think this year, and for many years, insufficient public funding therefore follows into tackling fraud. So my third point is I think we've got into a cycle. Whereas because we have not been concerned enough by fraud, we've not seen it as a priority, it doesn't attract enough investment, enough strategic thinking, and therefore it continues to grow. And we have to break the cycle. So I think this report, more than any others, and I've been in this field for quite a long time, and there's been a lot of reports, mainly pointing out the problems I've set out there. But this for me is a major step forward about breaking that cycle. It's collated clear evidence of the threat posed to national security because we've looked at it as a national problem of where is the money going to and what's it funding. Those three issues absolutely hit the nail on the head for me. A lack of leadership. Helena Wood, you said everyone's problem but no one's priority. We need national accountable leadership. There is no national strategy. There must be a national strategy. And what would turn the wheel on this, it has to be a policing priority in the strategic policing response. Otherwise, nothing will happen. So the three problems you've identified come out to have those three major recommendations, which I think, if we can get them adopted, will shift the dial on fraud. To summarize then, my 3 points. We need to look at the problem of fraud down the small end of the telescope, see the bigger picture and think, where are the millions of frauds turning into the billions of pounds going? Who we should be concerned about where it's going, who gets it and what they're doing with it. Secondly, modern day fraud is perpetrated on an industrial scale by a virtual mafia. We need to have an industrialized and organized response. And thirdly, we have to break that cycle by which fraud is never recognized as a priority and therefore always will be a Cinderella service. Recognizing that a new approach is needed, one that centers fraud as a national threat to our prosperity and to our individual security. So thank you, Tom.
Mike, thank you very much. You triggered an inflow of questions. And just to those of you who are posting your questions, thank you very much for those. I forgot to mention that if you like a question, particular amount, do use the upvote function. Just click on that and that will rise to the top of the list and hopefully will give us a sense of what people would really like to hear more about. I'm going to give Helen an opportunity to respond in a moment, but before we do that, let me please turn to Amber Rudd. Amber, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tom. And it feels like such a timely moment to be having this discussion, given that fraud is one of the areas that has thrived in the pandemic. We hear that 1 in 3 people have received invitations that are fraudulent to part with money. As other people have struggled during the pandemic, as physical crime in some areas has reduced, fraud online has got better and better as far as the fraudsters are concerned. I'm going to make some comments in response to the paper, and then just some political points of my own in terms of the leadership issue. First of all, I think it's a fantastic paper, and I'm really delighted that RUSI have done this, because it really gets to the heart of the complexity of the problem, as well as the need for a whole of systems response. And I agree also entirely with Mike's points, which is that this has been growing and growing, and the lack of a proper strategic response to it has been a growing, gaping hole in government action. But let me just put that in context from my own experiences. I became Home Secretary in June 2016, well, just after June 2016, after the referendum, and I was amazed to find that the agenda for the first National Security Council I attended under Theresa May was serious organised crime. And she was rubbing her hands in glee that at last she could control the agenda for the NSC. And she certainly understood how important organised crime was, and the role that organised criminals played in upsetting the 4 Ps, including, as Helena set out, protecting our people. And fraud was completely at the centre of that in terms of financing terrorism lives. I really appreciate that distinction in the paper: terrorist lives, not terrorist activity, but one will lead to the other, and in disrupting people's lives. And I think it took her experience as Home Secretary to really appreciate that. And I think I've really felt at that first NSC that other people attending were slightly surprised that the NSC, which after all was only formed under David Cameron and felt like it had a much more of an international mandate with the intelligence officer community there, the armed forces officers community there, that they were being asked to look inward really at the issue of the day, which for her was serious and organised crime. And it led to other initiatives under Theresa May, one of which was the Economic Crime Board and an economic crime minister. And I remember well having the meetings with her, with Mark Carney, with the NCA, Lynn Owen, and with Cressida Dick around this issue. But this goes to the heart really of what both the paper was saying and Mike was saying, is that any new initiative, however important, takes real leadership. And this mattered to Theresa May because she'd been Home Secretary for so long and had seen the impact, and it mattered to me. And it's become lower down the priorities. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for them. Us having our meeting on Zoom is one of them, but it is a mistake given the scale of the growing problem. I agree with the point in the paper about the sheer ubiquity of fraud. Everybody knows somebody if they themselves haven't been a victim of fraud. And everybody actually in government who's running a department will have some way or other have interacted with it. I think that in my final job as Secretary of State for DWP, I had a particularly harsh experience of it, because in the good intentions of DWP to help people access universal credit as quickly as possible when they needed it, we made it easier and easier for people to prove their identity. Now, naturally, that led to problems because we wanted people who needed the financial support of the state to get it, not to have long waits, but that was an opening for fraud. And you combine that with the whole digitalization of the systems. Again, as Mike was referring to it, we're all sort of digital by default so much now that I feel this made a perfect cocktail for fraudsters. And it was difficult to program our universal credit systems to spot Mr. M. Mouse and Mr. D. Duck, who occasionally made appearances along with other fictional characters. So it was always worrying, the scale of the fraud in terms of the department that I was running. And it was difficult because of the digital issue to really get it right. And I think there is still a problem with that in DWP, and there will be in other departments as well. And the consequence of that is not just taxpayers' money, which is bad. It's the impact on people's lives to whom the fraud is sometimes committed when you get the identity fraud. And it's also depressing and debilitating and demoralizing for the staff, for instance, in a job centre who know that people are committing fraud and aren't able to stop it. So I think there's a big problem there in terms of the digitalization of our lives, and public services fall into that danger as well, which reinforces the need to have the whole systems approach that the paper is suggesting. On serious organised crime, again, I totally agree with the paper that fraud is an important part of how serious organised crime operates. It reminds me to respond to Helena's quote with another quote of the Sutton Law, which is, why do you rob banks? Because that is where the money is. So naturally, that is where people go who want to commit the crimes. They're less likely to bang down the doors of the banks. They're much more likely to go online and find a way of committing fraud in order to fund all sorts of other online crimes and activities. Which brings me on to another point, which is the public. And although the public are certainly aware of the scale of fraud, they are more aware of the criminal activity on their doorstep. And it feels to me like the public are much more focusing towards what's going on in the streets than they are to what's going on online. As we invested as a government more and more in cybercrime and tried to, for instance, protect young women from being, or indeed protect children from being abused online, we needed to put more resources into that, and resources are only finite. So people may get irritated with the fact that they didn't think there were enough police on the street, but a lot of that police work was going into protecting their families online. And I think fraud has the same issue. The public want to see more police on the street. Those are not the police who will be doing the work online to protect their money and indeed their families. And I think that politicians need to level with the public a bit here, that the scale of crime online, fraud being one of them, needs more investment, just as they may feel that police on the street is a priority to them. And the report also talks about terrorism, funding terrorism. And as I say, I think that the issue of funding terrorist lifestyles is really the key, as you would expect in an organization where organized crime is part of how terrorists exist as well. I think that one of the issues that we need to look at as well, which is looked at a bit in the report, is the role of identity theft. And this comes back to digitalization as well, and is an area which is going to become worse and worse, i.e. people are going to become more and more vulnerable. The role of banks, in a way, I think is very interesting here, where they have played in the past and are still playing now, but it can't go on indefinitely, a very active role in protecting the public, sometimes, sending people to action fraud to help pay for it in terms of the investigations, but also paying back to people who've been a victim of fraud the money, sometimes just very easily and straightforwardly, which is great, but it masks the scale of the problem. So I would come back, and my conclusions from looking at this paper and my experience as Home Secretary is that there has been an effort, there has been a recognition to address fraud as a serious issue that should be taken forward by the NSC. Because of various other priorities over the past few years, it feels to me like that's fallen away. And we would love to, and I think it's a very good initiative, to try and get it back up the agenda, because the scale of it, the scale of fraud, the number of people being impacted, and the devastation to people's lives is going to make that more and more necessary.
Amber, thank you very much. Just a small observation I would make is that I think when you were Home Secretary, Ben Wallace had economic crime added to his title, and that appendix appears to have fallen off in the job description of the most recent incumbent. Helena, before we turn to questions, any quick points you would like to make? We've got lots of questions, so don't feel the urge to go on. But if you want to make any quick comebacks, please do.
That's Tom recognising my tendency towards verbosity. So thank you for checking me in there, Tom. Couple of comments from me. I mean, to Mike's point on this is an industrial scale crime that needs an industrial scale response. Absolutely, and we've started to see the intelligence community show, flex their muscle in the space. We've had GCHQ setting up the suspicious email reporting service, which I'd really recommend to people to check out. We've got to go for a disruption-based approach in many respects, because a lot of this threat, it does come from overseas, and you cannot have a criminal investigation into every single one of these frauds. So we really have to use the might of people like GCHQ. And then touching on the policing point, which both our speakers made, fraud doesn't fare well under the, say, morale scoring, which kind of prioritises operations in local policing. It fares really badly under the organised crime group mapping process that many people watching today will be familiar with. And because those systems were designed around fundamentally different crimes that are less geographically dispersed than fraud. So it speaks to me, you need to redesign the system somewhat around fraud, or it will never get prioritised, either within local policing or in the regional organised crime units. The other point I'd touch on, very much agree with Amber's point around bobbies on the beat. I frequently say I'd rather see less bobbies on the beat, actually, because we know the threat isn't really there. Who burgles anymore? Who breaks into cars? Because car stereos aren't worth nicking. The real money to be made is online. So I think people need to understand that a bit better. It's incumbent on the government not to just bow to pressure and populism there, and actually explain what modern day policing looks like. But I'll stop there and open the floor to questions.
Great, Helena, thank you very much. Well, I think we'll turn first, or stay on the first point you raised there around this call that I think both you and Mike have made for kind of an intelligence-led response to this, or at least a more analytical focus on this. So a pretty direct question here. What sort of response have you had, Helena, as you've been preparing the paper from the intelligence community? You mentioned there some evidence of GCHQ getting involved in this issue, but more broadly, what sort of response have you had from that community?
Well, they tend towards silence as a typical facet of what they do. But what I will say is, those working on fraud within the system very much welcomed it, but they kind of fear for their future, and whether the SARS, the new suspicious email reporting service, was set up merely as a kind of COVID knee-jerk rather than a long-term component of our counter-fraud landscape. So that's really been their response, and it will really take that national security tasking to make others on either side of the Thames care about it, to be honest. But I think GCHQ really understands their role, but it needs long-term funding. It goes back to that.
Okay, Mike, perhaps to you from your seat at CIFAS, and Amber may have a view on this as well. Obviously, there are a lot of different government bodies that could be involved in stepping up the response to fraud, whether it's the National Crime Agency, the Serious Fraud Office, all sorts of bodies that I got followed on Twitter yesterday by the NHS Fraud Reporting Unit or something like that. There are a whole load of these. How does that come? Does that come together at the moment? Does that need to come together? And if it does need to come together, how do we make it more coherent in terms of operation? So
this is a really important point. We do have a lot of counter-fraud bodies in the environment, and as Amber alludes to, there have been efforts to try to coordinate that in a better way through the Joint Fraud Task Force, and currently through initiative of the regulators plus the banks and telcos and Stop Scams UK, looking at authorised push payment fraud. But I think that there isn't sufficient coordination and direction around that. The National Crime Agency's National Economic Crime Centre over the last 18 months, 2 years, is starting to find its feet in that area. But again, it comes down to the resourcing and the importance and the pull of the resources within the National Crime Agency. And I recall I cut my teeth as a customs investigator, and you have cases which are fraud and you have cases which are drug smuggling cases. And you're always pulled in the direction of, you can't ignore that drug smuggling case, so the fraud case gets pushed back. And I think there's always that tension until it's the reason you get up in the morning is actually to fight fraud, and your job is also to coordinate that. So I think we probably have too many bodies, but I'm not advocating that we have a change in that framework and start merging and spend quite a lot of time creating a new agency, if you like. But I do think that we need that strong direction, strategy, and a leadership role, whether it's in the Home Office or here on the NSC. I think that we might want to have a change of approach here, and that's why I think I support that particular recommendation.
I do recall, of course, the Joint Fraud Task Force, and one of its strengths was that it had attendance from different ministerial departments, as well as from, I think, from yourself, Mike, and from UK FI representing the banks, and a few others. And that was quite an effective way of addressing what types of new frauds were coming out and how we could combat them and what the banks were doing. But I think that whatever organization is pulled together to try and deliver changes, it needs proper ministerial leadership in order to have the funds and the priority. And that takes some lobbying and campaigning. But one of the things we didn't mention as well is that MPs do their surgeries every week. And of course, they do them online at the moment, but it's nothing like your constituents coming and telling you about their experience to make it an MP's priority. So I think that will be making its way, and it feels to me like it is from hearing from MPs raising this, making it up their list of priorities. And once it becomes an MP's priority, it will make its way to becoming a ministerial one.
Amber, if I could just stay with you, because one of the things that, and Mike, you touched on this, but one of the things that happened, kind of flourished when you were Home Secretary, is this kind of joint working between the public sector and the private sector around economic crime in general. So the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force that we're all familiar with. One thing that Mike mentioned is that, of course, the vectors through which fraud is conducted actually involves people who are outside the traditional public-private partnership community when it comes to economic crimes. I'm thinking of social media companies, telecom companies, and so on. What more would you like to see done to bring them into the tent? I was struck by evidence of Graham Bigger at the Treasury Select Committee recently, who I could sort of hear tearing his hair out when he was trying to, goad the social media companies and so on to get involved. So what can we do to get them properly involved? Because they clearly are a fundamental part of all this.
They certainly are. And I recall well in the Home Office working with Graham and others to get them to take action about removing terrorist material online, actually, surprisingly, given their behavior since then, with some success. But it feels to me like those companies are slightly on the run at the moment. And I would say that whoever has the sort of lead relationship with them in government should perhaps engage with them on this on the basis of this is something you can really help with, which might actually improve your reputation rather than having so much negative attack, which has been happening because of the various other issues over the past few months. So engaging them would be a fantastic way forward as well. And hopefully they could see this something that they could do some good on when at the moment they're perceiving as doing some harm.
Yeah. Hannah, back to you. Obviously, the paper mainly looked at the role of the way terrorists and serious organised crime engage with fraud. Was there any evidence or any sense that there was kind of state-based involvement of fraud directed towards the UK from the usual suspects of Russia or China or similar? Did that come up at all?
Well, it seemed in every interview we did with government officials, someone slipped in kind of state-sponsored fraud as a means of disrupting the UK. But sadly, to get it through a peer-reviewed process, we couldn't find any open source evidence of that. But it certainly seems that is something people are concerned about. So whether it's happening or whether there is a sort of conspiracy theorist view within government, the jury's quite out on that one. But I absolutely could see, if you are wanting to disrupt a country as a malign state actor, what's a really quick and easy way to cause some pain? Rip off a load of ID through your very technical cyber capabilities, disrupt the financial system, undermine people's fundamental trust in doing business online, and fundamental trust in banking. That would be a really good start. So I think it's not something we included in the paper, but it's something we'll be diving into in the future, I'm sure. So
an important question about funding's been raised, and Mike, perhaps this might be one for you. There is an economic crime levy, or potentially to be introduced, which was announced last year, if I remember rightly. But of course, that can only be spent or levied on those who are under the money laundering regs. So how are we going to properly fund the response to fraud? Whatever the right response is, clearly the funding as it currently stands is not appropriate. How should we be properly funding the response to fraud?
Well, I would argue some of that economic crime levy should be looked in that direction. 40% of money laundering, the predicate offences, are fraud. So and I think we need to point out that it's a continuum between, once you've done a fraud, you have to launder it through the bank accounts of others or through accounts you control. So I think there is some argument around looking at this economic crime wider than just the money laundering issue. I think they could be looking for a wider levy, or the fact that we should be looking at the businesses who create some of the problems. We talked about big tech there. Shamefully, actually, they don't do enough around their platforms being abused by criminals. We see the telco industry or other industries who can be part of the solution, because, for example, on one-time password SMS messages around your security around your bank accounts. So I think there could be a possibility of a wider levy. But at the end of the day, we do have to argue for a fair share of the government's pot as well. And perhaps there is just that coming together about that public-private arrangements and knocking the heads together. And I think Amber said around getting various ministers together to say, okay, what the government, different departments going to bring, and what would the private sector do on, say, match funding. I think in the past, when there have been initiatives on match funding, business has been willing to put money in because it's losing, where the government also says they're putting money in. So I don't think that we should, perhaps so much of we in-depth thought about austerity, the government doesn't have money. It does have money. It's about where we argue it puts it. But I think they're more likely to put money in if they also know the private sector are going to match that funding, because we've taken this problem seriously.
Okay, so I just want to turn now to the question of kind of prevention and reimbursement, which I think is a kind of a thorny issue. And Mike, if I could just perhaps stay with you for a second, and then Amber, I'll come to you for a kind of perhaps a constituent perspective. There's obviously a lot of focus on people should be reimbursed when they suffer fraud. How do we turn the mindset or balance that mindset with a much greater focus on prevention? If I walk out of the front door of my house and I leave the door wide open, the insurance company won't have a lot of interest in helping me out. And that's not to say that everyone who gets defrauded has themselves to blame. But how do we make thinking about fraud kind of a mindset that people accept more easily?
It is one of those thorny issues, and the whole issue of shifting of liability between banks and individuals who might have been defrauded, and the contingent reimbursement model that's been brought in on a voluntary basis for the banks to be able to be liable for those losses rather than the customer. I think we should start from the point of view that fraudsters in this arena are very sophisticated and will manipulate individuals, and we should not see the losses going to those individuals. But we shouldn't see that the buck finally stops completely with the banks without there being investment in chasing down the perpetrators, stopping this in the first place. So some of that must be around public education campaigns, around what are the secure measures and the things that we can all do to ensure that we have closed the doors and windows of our internet and connections and our mobile connections, so that we understand and consumers understand their role in preventing fraud. But we can't just allow £456 million a year from authorised push payment fraud being paid out by the banks and no one chasing where it's going to. So this is, I think, when Helena's talking about an end-to-end process, we're kind of just sorting out, well, who pays? Well, I don't want to be having an argument for years and years about who pays £450 million a year to the fraudsters and the criminals. We should be saying that we want to reduce that by chasing it down, putting preventive measures in place, and public education. So I think there needs to be a holistic response to that kind of issue of scam frauds.
Amber, to you, so from your experience, I mean, how does that balance lie in the people that used to come into your constituency office?
Well, I think Mike puts it very well, is that in a way, most people who I met down in my constituency when I was a member of parliament, even though they lost money, they got it back from the bank. I remember particularly an elderly lady who'd insisted, despite her bank manager's objection, in a person-to-person conversation in her bank, that she wanted to take out her savings of £5,000 and hand it over in return for something to somebody she'd recently met. And he tried to stop her, but she insisted. And of course, it was indeed a scam. And they repaid the money to her, which is fantastic. Great result. I think I secured her vote and I needed it. So there's plenty of evidence that banks do take, I think, a sympathetic approach. I also think that they have also really tightened up their management of how people spend money and, more importantly, send money. I find that if I go to a new town and I try and spend money, quite often my bank account is frozen. It can be a bit embarrassing, but I think that that's immaterial compared to feeling secure. But in a way, that doesn't stop the growth of fraud, does it? And this is it's a good point that Mike is making, is that people have to be chased down so that they can't commit these crimes with impunity, and the banks just take the cost, or the insurance company, and it carries on.
So we obviously can't have this conversation without thinking about the whole fraud related to COVID. And I just wonder, Mike, if you could briefly explain kind of what's happened over the last 12 months to try and combat what is obviously a honeypot opportunity for fraudsters with all the grant making by government. And then Helena, perhaps come to you for some reflections on that.
So I think there's been a lot of activity around the authorised lenders through the Bounce Back Loans scheme. I think all of those are in CIFAS membership, and they are sharing data and intelligence and screening against the National Fraud Database to begin with. And we work with the British Business Bank to build for them a duplicate check-in system, because you're only meant to get one of those loans. So I think within the banking sector, there was already well-established methods to kind of check on what was fraudulent. We have seen impersonations, and there was an always pressure to get that money out. And I think that's always the trade-off between speed and security, which there is. So I think there's been a reasonable response around bounce back loans because there's already in place, and we built quite quickly mechanisms to reduce fraud. I think there's probably going to be seen much more fraud within the grants that were passed through local authorities who don't have that same infrastructure. Only some of them didn't make any checks, and we know that. And so that's being passed back out. And that's quite worrying today, when another 5 billion and 600,000 grants to high streets is going through the same routes. And that will be a part of, there needs to be mechanisms right away to check who that's going to and validate those. So I think there's been a real mixed picture with the established lenders being able to use the techniques and tools they have. But when it's going through other routes, which are not so used to it, I think we're exposed. What we have seen, I think, has been a really good feature of the last year, is that community coming together to share intelligence through the NEC, City of London Police, UK Finance, ourselves, various organisations sharing quickly what are the new attacks that are coming, what are the new phishing attacks, and sharing that information and getting that out. So I think it's been a bit of a model in the last year, which we need to sustain, about that sharing of intelligence to tackle fraud as it evolves. So there are big numbers thrown around about the extent of what fraud could be, but I think in the end, we're going to find out in a number of years what the real extent of the fraud has, will turn out as loans go bad, delinquency and loans, and whether they were actually delinquency or whether they were stolen funds.
Thanks, Mike. So Helena, perhaps a last word to you on this.
Well, it's my job to be quite harsh on government, isn't it? But what I will say as an opening gambit is, we have to accept fraud will happen. Where there is money, there will be fraud, whether it's private sector or public sector. We're not expecting the government to have had a zero fail environment in regard to its COVID response. But we absolutely do know from our discussions across the system that decisions were made against officials' advice to go for speed rather than safety in the design of some of those systems. So for my part, the balance between getting that money out to support viable businesses and getting that money out safely and protecting it against the inevitable organised crime that was going to target those schemes, I think that balance for me was off. And I think the scale will come out as possibly not at the 23 billion that's been kind of touted around the press, but it's certainly going to be multiple billions. And when you get into billions, I think you get into public inquiry territory for me. Someone, after the kind of dust has settled, really needs to look at fundamentally who made decisions where about the design of those schemes, because that is multiple billions of public money that's not going to come back.
Helena, thank you. Amber, you are welcome to the last word. Chip in.
I didn't necessarily want the last. I just wanted to challenge Helena on the consequences of a better designed system that didn't have as much fraud, but might have taken another month, which would have led to hundreds, thousands of businesses going bust. I mean, maybe there was a calculation that the price of the potential fraud is worth saving X amount of jobs, businesses. A really well-designed system would have taken a year. Obviously, that's too long. What is the right amount to get that balance?
Yeah, and I guess we've seen today, and we're talking just after the Chancellor has delivered his budget. We've seen today, obviously, money being put forward to create some kind of task force to go after that. So I think, it's a terrible thing to say. We are where we are. I think the mistake would be not to kind of learn the lessons and to assume that money is lost, and we can't use investigation into the fraud related to COVID as the thin end of a wedge that might lead to the identification of perhaps bigger fraud structures, or to Mike's point from earlier on, is there an intelligence dividend to take from all this analysis? Well, we've kind of come to the end of our hour, so thank you very much to Helena for presenting the paper. I know it was a labour of love while she juggled home schooling. So thank you, Helena, to you. Thank you, Mike, for your support from CIFAS, and Amber, as a RUSI trustee, thank you for joining us today. Just a quick note, if I may, while I have everybody. Our next event will be on the 22nd of March. And we'll consider the vexed issue of beneficial ownership transparency from a UK, US and EU perspective, and in particular how we should make effective use of all the information that is increasingly being collected as company registries develop. This will present a paper written by my colleague Anton Moisenko, and you can sign up via the RUSI website as usual. And if, of course, you would like to know more about our work at RUSI Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, do please stay in touch with us and our publications and our events by following us on Twitter at CFCS_RUSI and sign up for our CFCS mailing list that you can find via our website at rusi.org/CFCS. So thank you to our audience for joining us today. Thank you for all your questions. The array of questions, I think, just shows what a broad issue fraud is. In the public sector, in the private sector, corporate, individual, really a huge topic that I think we must work harder to get our arms around. And thank you again, a virtual round of applause to our panelists, Helena, Amber and Mike. Thank you all, stay well and have a good day. Bye for now.